Dynasty. Over 50 years of chaos followed, until a military general named Zhao Kuang
said after the Tang
Dynasty. Over 50 years of chaos followed, until a military general named Zhao Kuang founded the Song Dynasty, reigning as Emperor Taizu. The Song Dynasty started in the year 960 AD and lasted for over 300 years. It can be split into two periods: the Northern Song, starting in the year 960, and then after the north was invaded by Jurchen tribes in the year 1127 AD, the Southern Song. When Emperor Taizu came to power, he expanded the civil service examination system and oversaw a project to map the entire empire. The Song saw the revival of Confucianism and a greater prominence of the scholar official class. But the Song wasn't as strong militarily as its Tang Dynasty predecessor. It couldn't establish itself as the dominant power in Asia. Thus, the Northern Song period was marked by frequent battles with neighboring kingdoms. These would eventually culminate in the Jurchen tribe to the north invading the Song and conquering the capital Kaifeng in the year 1127 AD. They then set up the Jin Dynasty in the north of China. So the Song Dynasty moved south, and despite losing a large amount of territory, the Southern Song period was one of prosperity, with flourishing art and culture, as well as technological advancements. During the Song, the government started to grant farmers ownership of land, which led to a huge increase in rice production. The economy started to change from a purely agricultural economy to a commercial one, with peasants selling their surpluses to buy a wide range of goods, such as tea, coal, oil, and wine. With the growth in the economy, so grew the population, hitting 100 million by the year 1100 AD. Three of China's four great inventions originate from the Song Dynasty, namely printing, the magnetic compass, and gunpowder. The Song government used its printing techniques for currency production, and in the 12th century became the first government in the world to print paper money. The Song was also the first Chinese dynasty to establish a permanent standing navy, to safeguard foreign trade and guard against invasions from the north. The ships used the newly invented compass to navigate and used gunpowder in their weaponry. Gunpowder was first employed in bombs delivered from ships via catapult. The Song used these tactics to successfully defend their territory against Jurchen invasion on the Yangtze River in the year 1161 AD. A Song force of only 3,000 men on 120 ships defeated a Jurchen force of 70,000 on over 600 ships. Yet these technological advancements did not allow the Song to take back the north. This was due to the rise of several powerful states in the region, and the fact that enemies often managed to kidnap Song craftsmen who were then forced to manufacture the technology for the enemy. This lack of military power was alarming to Song scholars and officials, who felt a need to preserve Chinese culture from potential extinction, and thus started to reject any foreign influences. A revival of Confucianism was seen as the best way to achieve this. When the likelihood of regaining the north seemed remote, the Southern Song scholars gave a lot of attention to how Confucian principles could be applied to society rather than to politics. They proposed ways to build a better society, focusing on families and communities. The most famous of the Song Dynasty Confucian scholars was a man named Zhu Xi, who would go on to leave a legacy lasting 700 years. Like the scholars, Song painters also mimicked the mood of the time in their artworks. Northern Song painters like Fan Quan painted huge, grand landscape scenes.
So this, the whole art of landscape painting really became perfected, Chinese landscape painting during this time.
Whereas after the loss of the north, paintings became more intimate, focusing on family or village scenes within the natural environment.
We saw some of that.
Scenes would often be in one corner, with a large empty expanse occupying much of the painting. This empty expanse may have alluded to a feeling of emptiness after losing the north, and the feeling that matters beyond the immediate local society were beyond control of the painter.
I think the paintings also reflected the spiritual tradition. It's like these are almost like for me, there's a meditative quality to it. It's like a place where you sit and go within, and the scenes, not all of them, but the scenes kind of suggest that. With that open space, there's like just opening to infinity, really. There's this one place, one tree, one location, and kind of, yeah, it's like it invites the viewer to settle in, just go within, and open up to the space, both outside and inside. That's what I get from it.
And indeed, the fate of the dynasty was even beyond the control of Song officials and the emperor, for a new power was rising in Asia, the Mongols. Led by Genghis Khan, the Mongols started wars with the Xia and Jin dynasties to the north of the Song in 1205 AD. Initially, the Song formed an alliance and aided the Mongols in invading the Jin in 1232 AD. After 2 years of war, the Jin fell. Yet when Song forces took back their old capital Kaifeng, as well as Chang'an and Luoyang, the Mongols broke the alliance. The Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, started their assault on the Song, and in 1271 AD, Kublai declared the creation of a new dynasty, the Yuan. The last strongholds of Song resistance were crushed in 1279 AD, and the dynasty came to an end. Although the Song was destroyed, the dynasty succeeded in protecting Chinese culture, and particularly Confucian values. The scholar Zhu Xi's commentaries on the Confucian classics form the basis of the imperial examinations from not long after the Song dynasty ended until their abolishment in 1905. Song dynasty landscape paintings are now displayed in museums across the world, and the free inventions of printing, the compass, and gunpowder, whether for better or worse, have played a large role in shaping the world as we know it today. Chinese culture survived through the period of Mongol rule and went on to flourish in the great Ming and Qing dynasties that followed.
Right, it's a bit about their music. We should have a Chinese consultant to help them integrate the music more into the narrative. Yeah, and during that time period, what was happening in Western Europe in those pre-Renaissance? Not a lot. And how come that's not taught in schools? Like, so, Chris, this is a short presentation from Christie's about their ceramics. Beautiful ceramics.
Ceramics are some of the most complicated, most involved works of art. There are the clays, the glazes, the different decorative types. Then there are the kilns and the firing temperatures. I found all of that really interesting to study and to unravel and figure out. The works in this sale come from the Linyu Shanren collection, one of the world's finest and most comprehensive collections of Song Dynasty ceramics. Song ceramics refer to ceramics produced during China's Song Dynasty, which runs from the 10th century to the 13th century. The works have very straightforward shapes, and they're characterized by light-colored, subtly hued glazes. Each kiln during the Song Dynasty generally was best known for one type of ware. This is a conical bowl from the Ding kilns. The Ding kilns mainly produced white wares. These are the rarest of the rare in Chinese ceramics because of its black glaze. It has a porcelain body, a white body, which you can see on the underside. It was fired resting on its foot ring in the kiln, so the foot ring had to be left unglazed. The potter held it this way, dipping it into the glaze mixture, swirled it around. The position of the fingers left those indentations. With the dark glazes, the decoration is usually abstract. The very finest ones have the partridge feather mottles, which are simply brown flecks, evenly and harmoniously on the surface of the glaze. It's just a very rare and very wonderful piece. The Yangzhou kilns are best known for their celadon wares. In Song Dynasty ceramics, the principal decorative motifs are floral. Often we see a lotus, or we might see a peony, or in the case of the celadon piece, hibiscus. Once the piece has been shaped, the potter will incise or carve the decoration, let it dry, and then coat it with the glaze, and once that's dried, it's ready for firing. The Suzhou pieces are more complex. They use gray stoneware, but in order to make it resemble porcelain, they covered it all over with white slip to look like imperial dingware. Slip is a clay that's been ground to a fine powder and mixed with water. Once they've coated it with white slip, how do you decorate it? Their first inclination was to carve as they had in the celadon pieces. They incised the outlines of the floral decoration, then they took a scalpel and shaved away the slip. As the ware progresses, they move from this very laborious technique to painting. So this has a full coating of white slip, but instead of carving all of the decoration, as on the bowl, they have used a brush, which they dipped into black slip, and then painted on the surface. Just below the neck, they coated a circle with black slip, and then incised chrysanthemum petals in the same way that for the fish, they incised through the black slip in a crosshatch pattern. They were storage vessels for wine, for soy sauce, for vinegar. I think it's the simplicity, the straightforwardness, and in many cases the subtlety of the wares, which gives them a very contemporary feel. They may look simple, but there's a very complicated technique behind all of it. These are the ultimate achievement in those techniques, and they still serve as inspiration for potters today.
Which one did you like the best? Anybody? Others?
The
black
celadon.
one.
The black one?
Oops, sorry. People are answering all at once. That,
That's right.
yeah,
this
the one
one?
on the lower right. I
Yeah,
love
like
that.
that.
Oh my
Yeah.
God. The thinness of it, the thinness of the plate. A potter once told me it's very difficult to have your plate be thin. It's a real art in and of
Yeah.
itself. She didn't say that. I'm saying art in and of itself to have something not be thick.
Right.
But
Yeah.
that's not why I chose. I just think, yeah, well, the thinness
That's
and the
beautiful.
beauty.
No, it's just starburst, just pattern. This one, the one they painted on is amazing because you got to get it right the first time with the brush. You got to, and you imagine doing nearly the whole thing and then you mess up at the end. It's like you can't. It's like yeah. So the level of artistic skill and refinement is just amazing. I like these simple. I like them all, but I guess I'm drawn to the one with the painting on it the most, and the black the second. Anyone else?
I like the color celadon very much. I like that one.
This one?
It's so
Yeah.
subtle, this one.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So simple, really.
All right. So let's see what else. 34. Let's look at this. This gives an overview of Chinese landscape painting, not just the Song Dynasty, but they go through the song. Let's look at this. Minutes.
This exhibition is called Streams and Mountains Without End, Landscape Traditions of China, and it's actually been ongoing for more than a year and a half, but this version of it is the final installation. But we've changed all 60 paintings, and so people who have seen earlier editions of this exhibition can come again. They'll see all new paintings. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art has been collecting Chinese art for almost 150 years. In the first 30 or 40 years, most of what the Met collected was ceramics and other decorative arts. But then starting in 1913, the Met started to acquire Chinese paintings. But it wasn't until the 1970s that the Met got really serious about Chinese paintings and attempted to acquire masterpieces show the majesty of this tradition. And from 1973 going forward to today, there's been a major effort to be able to really represent the greatest of Chinese painting and calligraphy. And the key elements in that were major gifts by donors such as Douglas Dillon, Oscar Tang, John Crawford, and others who contributed majorly to the effort to bolster this collection and be able to bring to people visiting New York a sense of the majesty of the tradition. So this is one of the most celebrated, famous paintings in the Met's collection. It comes from the Song Dynasty from the early 12th century. The painting itself, we date by style alone. It doesn't have a signature by an artist on it, but it has all of this other material around it. You can see the writing at the top and the bottom by the famous collector and painter Zhang Daqian. And he had identified it as a work of Li Cheng, a 10th century painter, but we think it's probably a little bit later. What it depicts is a scholar riding on a donkey. He has a servant walking in front of him, carrying a bundle of scrolls, and then a servant walking behind him who's carrying a cylindrical sort of basket or storing documents. And an ancient old pine tree, it's actually started to lean over, and I mean, this relates back to a very old Chinese idea coming from the text called the Zhuangzi, that the greatest hope that a person should have is to be like an old tree, so old that it almost looks like it's dead, but in fact the tree is still alive and the tree still persists. This is a painting by Nizan, dated 1363. This is the Yuan Dynasty, the dynasty where China was ruled by Mongols. And it's ethnically Chinese scholars didn't have as many opportunities to serve in government, especially toward the end of the dynasty when famine and natural disaster and great chaos. You would never know it by looking at this extremely minimalist, stripped down, almost whisper quiet monochrome ink painting where the top third of the picture is essentially untouched paper, and then the middle section is untouched paper, and our eyes have a way of knitting together the image where we read that empty paper at the top as sky, and we see the empty paper that dominates the middle of the composition as water. The painting behind me is dated 1691. It was made for one of the grand interior spaces of the city called Yangzhou. This was a very wealthy city in 1691. There were patrons who needed big, splashy, impressive-looking paintings for their big, impressive-looking homes. And the artist who ran this workshop, Yuan Zhang, he specialized in serving these clients. This is a depiction of a real palace, a famous palace built in the Sui dynasty in the 6th century and then taken over by the Tang dynasty that followed it. Then you also get human figures within the painting itself. Down near the bottom here, you see a group of horse riders that are just getting ready to cross this arched stone bridge. And one of those horse riders is the emperor himself. I believe him to be the 2nd emperor of the Tang dynasty. This is a painting called Searching for My Parents. It's dated 1656, and it's by an artist named Huang Xiangjian. He's also known as Huang Xiaozi. And so he lost contact with his father, and so he set out from his house in Suzhou on foot.
Wow.
Took him about a year down to Yunnan province.
That's amazing.
He found his parents and he brought them back to Suzhou, and the whole round trip took 2 years. So we see at one point a military garrison where he was questioned really roughly by the soldiers who were there. You even see war elephants further on toward the end of the painting.
Yeah, so
This gallery is devoted exclusively to landscapes on painted fans, and some of those.
Amazing. I think that's a tradition where the painting is a narrative that unfolding story, and in these long scrolls. We'll see that later.
Those fans like this
Right,
one.
and it represents different time periods.
were actually made to be folded originally. All the other fans, other than this one in this room, are actually mounted as album leaves and since with landscapes on them, including some of these earlier fans painted on here. It's incredibly detailed. Just how elegant an object this is, just solely for the purpose of cooling yourself down on a summer day. The landscape didn't just find its way onto paintings in pre-modern China. It was suffusing all the surfaces that you might encounter in a kind of luxurious environment, including lacquer and bamboo carving, and in this case, ceramics. So this is this enormous porcelain vase made at Jingdezhen, the great ceramic city in Jiangxi province. And you have a guy here gesturing at the waterfall and pointing it out to his friends. And then the eye leads us upward to towering pines. And then we get a second register of landscape and porcelain.
Wow, amazing. Look at that. Jeez.
This is a painting dated 1829 by an artist, Su Renshan, and he was from Guangdong province. This is a painting by a 14-year-old.
Was it later?
He was a prodigy, and as I said, he was self-taught. By this point in his career, he's already starting to cycle through different types of painting. By the time he's in his 20s, his paintings look very different than this. He's struggled with mental illness later in his life, and he actually died somewhat young. And along the left edge of the painting, there's a single column of text, and that text is written by the artist himself, our 14-year-old. The other inscription is by, of course, his father.
14.
I mentioned before that this exhibition ranges all the way from the 12th century to the 21st century, and this is a painting dated 1977. And it's by a painter named Wu Guanzhong. This is waves at this coastal area called Beidaihe. It's almost entirely abstract. And then at the top, he dropped in a few boats. This painting is by Zhang Daqian, one of the titans of Chinese modernism. He was not only a painter, I mentioned him earlier as a collector. He was one of the top 5 collectors of Chinese painting. Some of these ink contour lines that he's dropped on top of the color field of azurite blue and malachite green, you can read those as sort of fissures in a mountain. Paintings from this period are really treasured within the history of kind of modern Chinese painting as a breakthrough.
Oh, look at that. I like that.
This painting from 1971 is by an artist who we know by 2 names, either C.C. Wong, as he was known in the United States, or Wang Jiqian, his Chinese name. He was a collector and a painter and a calligrapher who left China in the late 1940s. He brought paintings with him at a level of quality that were very rare in the United States, like Zhang Daqian, and they were friends. And the core of the Met's collection of early Song and Yuan Dynasty paintings actually come from C.C. Wong's collection through purchases in the 1970s and then later through purchases and donations by other donors, principally Oscar Tang, in the 1990s and through to today. As a painter, he's really interesting because he's really seeking to use these materials to create something modern and sometimes nearly abstract.
So that's interesting, just an overview of the evolution of landscape painting from the Song Dynasty forward. But what comes through is this very different way of perceiving the world or expressing it in art in the West, right? Less is more. Keep it just the simplicity of the design, the reduced colors, the open space, at least let the imagination, don't cramp it in with lots, join it, don't over represent it, just suggestions, lines, getting more and more abstract into the 20th century, 21st century. But even before, there's still an abstract quality. Even this, it's a suggestion of, they're not trying to, he's not trying to portray a mountain in detail. And most of his painting is empty space. if you look at it, there's probably 80%, I would guess, is all empty space. And just the, lines, a little suggestion of trees and the tops of trees. Same thing, very, just barely suggested. A few lines that suggest structures, wooden structures. And then the, graying out, fading out. But it's all, most of it's just left to your imagination. Any comments? Yes, no?
About this particular, it's just,
Well, no,
it's just too small to really see clearly,
Uh-huh.
to make comments. The
comments.
thing that struck me was one of the fans that had a
Yeah.
cascading waterfall on it.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God, that was
That's beautiful,
phenomenal.
wasn't it? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
beautiful. It's amazing.
I
I remember that one.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, that's just beautiful. All right, so what time we have here? 2:47. Let's jump into this BBC Michael Wood, and he's the one that does the history of India too. So, and I like him a lot. It's 59 minutes long, and it's all focused on the Song Dynasty. Okay, and he's going to give us a lot of information about it, and he does it. I think he does it really well. Yeah.
Small towns across America.
Rosh Hashanah.
Hey, get back there. Come on.
In the 10th century, China almost broke apart forever in civil war.
So this isn't the first documentary, and he's doing the story of China, and he's done previous ones leading up to this. So this is the golden age.
The soldier poet Wang Renyu witnessed the destruction of his country. The barbarians have overthrown the Tang Dynasty, he wrote. Our cities have been abandoned. Our temple courtyards lie in ruin. China has entered a truly dark time. But things cannot go on like this forever. The way surely has not been finally lost. I believe heaven will soon announce a new dynasty. And in around the year 960, it did. In the West, we see history as the rise and fall of different civilizations. In China, there's one civilization which has gone through cycles of order and disorder. And in the Middle Ages, like Europe after the Second World War, the Chinese set out to build a brave new world. In the story of China, we've reached the Song Dynasty. We're in the city of Kaifeng in the middle of China. What? Mushroom. Mushroom, yeah, okay. 1,000 years ago, this was the greatest and most exciting place on Earth. Its creativity and inventiveness surpassed and, of course, preceded the European Renaissance.
Did you hear that? It's considered the greatest
Yes.
city on earth at the time.
In the Song Renaissance, the Chinese set out to make the most enlightened society on Earth with the best governance, housing and food, the best education and science. And this is their story. Since the great age of the Tang Dynasty, China had shrunk dramatically. After 907, it fragmented into 16 dynasties in a little over 50 years. Warlords fighting each other for the empire. At this point, there was no certainty that China would ever be reunited. But as it says in China's famous novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, it is a truth universally acknowledged that everything long united will fall apart, and everything long divided will come back together again. The Song would transform Kaifeng from a provincial backwater into the greatest city on earth. And now it's rebuilding again. After the struggles of the 20th century, today's Chinese people are fascinated by the spectacle of what their ancestors achieved, and they want to touch that time again. And as always in Chinese history, great events were foretold by signs and omens. Here in Kaifeng, the most famous tells of the birth of two brothers who, like Romulus and Remus, would become the first emperors of the new dynasty. The story goes like this. At the time of chaos and war and destruction, after the fall of the Tang Dynasty, a man called Chen Tuan fled to the sacred mountain Huashan, where he lived in a cave and became a hermit. And he acquired prophetic, visionary powers. And one day, he came off the mountain, and in the road, he met a crowd of refugees, and there was a poor man carrying two baskets on a pole on his shoulders. And when the hermit looked into the basket, there were two baby boys, but the hermit saw dragons. And he roared out with laughter. And everybody said, "Why are you laughing?" And he said, "I never expected that the mandate of heaven would come back to earth so quickly."
是赵匡胤他这一道节，这一道节是出两个龙，出两条龙，就是皇帝嘛，都有面嘛。但是大家都知道这一道节出两条龙，这就是皇帝出生的那一道节，都当上皇帝了嘛。也就是出两条龙嘛，就是双龙，知道吧？
挑个条子，一头挑到弟弟，一头挑到哥。套皇来到这儿，他父亲给他母亲来套皇要饭。
要饭知道不知道？
挑个条子，一头挑个小孩，这头挑个小孩，挑到这儿。因为啥要挑到这儿呢？因为这个地方开封是个府。 是个就是按现在说首都，西头一个龙，现在还在，西头一个龙还在，那龙头还在。
可以了。好，再见啊。再见。
There's the surviving dragon. The last dragon of Twin Dragon Alley. Any day now, Twin Dragon Alley will be redeveloped, and soon only the memory will remain. But that's Kaifeng for you, China's city of memory. In 960, the older brother, Taizu, announced the new dynasty, the Song. And he made the capital here a vast new metropolis of wood and brick thrown up in a feverish construction boom.
This is Song building manual, commissioned in the early 12th century. If you are of a certain social status and if you can afford it, you can build your house according to these styles.
So this tells you how to build a city almost, doesn't it?
Well, for a city of over 1 million people, you would need lots of buildings.
Biggest city in the world, perhaps, at that time?
Yes, definitely, at that time.
And to go with the new buildings was a whole new conception of city life.
Kaifeng was a much more open city. The lifestyle was much more vibrant than the town Chang'an. All sorts of shops, all sorts of restaurants, even fast food. There's mention of fast food. And there was no curfew. That was very important. Before this, residents in the city, these urban dwellers, were supposed to stay in their own wards after the bell. But in Kaifeng, they were allowed to just flock to the markets and enjoy their time.
All the pleasures of city life really start to unfold in this time.
Yes.
So a new capital for a new age. The largest city anywhere on Earth until the 19th century. And just like today's China, the city became a magnet for people flooding in. In a few years, it went from 1 square mile to 16. Only a few ancient buildings survive today above ground. One of them is the famous Iron Pagoda, so called because of the metallic sheen of its tiles.
We're out in the northeast corner of the old city here. The Iron Pagoda is on a bit of raised ground in this corner. The emperor had built this artificial mountain called the Hill of Longevity. Wonderful, these Chinese names, aren't they?
Compared with Rome or Constantinople, very little survives from Kaifeng's golden age. And you can see why when you look below the ground. Down here is evidence of 20 devastating floods of the Yellow River since the Song Dynasty. This pit is a metaphor for the story of the city.
I've called Kaifeng the city of memory, China's capital of memory. And in this pit underneath the West Gate, you can see why. That is the Qing Dynasty city wall, the 18th and 19th century Qing Dynasty city wall. And this smaller brickwork here, the Ming Dynasty wall, Tudor period, part of it carries on down. And the Song Dynasty city wall, maybe 20 feet below the floor level here. It's an amazing thought, isn't it? And the reason why? That huge deposit of Yellow River mud, which is only a few miles from the city. These floods have been incredibly destructive all the way through Chinese history, sweeping through the whole city, destroying almost everything, even in recent times, 1842, for example. No wonder then that the city has been memorialized, if you like, not in stone, not in great buildings, but in words and in paintings.
"1 million people thronged these streets," said a song poet. "There were restaurants as far as the eye could see. Everywhere there was music in the air." What would we give to see that age again? But we can still see Song.
That's so cool. I mean, it sounds like New York City, right? Or London or somewhere.
In Kaifeng.
It does, yes.
In China's most famous work of art.
This is amazing. This.
As historical sources go, this is one of the most fabulous that exist in the world. It's a scroll. It's nearly 20 feet long. I'd need to unroll it across the middle of the street if we were going to do that. It's simply a depiction of the city as it was just before 1127 by a court painter, and it's the life of the ordinary people. There is nothing like this in the whole of history.
Look at that.
It gives you the streets, the alleyways, the hutongs, the shops, the taverns and restaurants, all of them real places. Mr. Wang's house, the spice shop, Shen Yang's licensed tavern, Physician Zhao's residence, the sugarcane shop, Dr. Yang's clinic.
Holy cool.
An amazing image of the sheer vitality of Song Dynasty China.
Here, 400 years before the European Renaissance, with its commitment to human values, was a city dedicated to the prosperity and well-being of its people. A city for the many, not just the few. Not kings or warriors or the church, but the lives of ordinary people.
They somebody animated this painting, and I've got another 10-minute thing. If there's time, I'll show it. But they're showing part of it now, so they brought it to life, and in one of the museums. You want to look at it for a minute?
Yes.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yes.
Okay. Since we're right here, a movie masterpiece. It's called. It's on YouTube. 12 minutes. I won't show the whole 12 minutes, but we'll just watch part of it. Copy. New tab. YouTube. I didn't need to do that. Just put it in. Fine. For the first time ever, using the wizardry crystal technologies, create a digital version of this ancient pink scroll that moves. And get it to move.
Right.
Come on. Let me do it again. Actually, I should have left the line in the middle there. Yeah, no cars, no pollution. That's kind of ideal, doesn't
It reminds me of towns in India of today.
Say that again?
It reminds me of towns of India of today. I mean, seriously, it's cool.
So that gives you a feel what it must have been like. Not to show that.
It's an image of themselves the Chinese have loved ever since. So much so that they couldn't resist bringing it back to
Right there,
life.
that's better.
Wow.
Journey back into a golden age. As one citizen recalled.
Oh, that's so much better.
There were such happy times. So many people and an abundance of things in the shops. The wonderful festivals. So many sights for the eye to enjoy. Above all, I remember the humane and congenial character of the citizens, always ready to help a stranger.
A good time to live, do you think?
The lamplit nights, the sounds of music from the myriad taverns and wine bars. But you see then, this was a time of peace.
这个世界很好，这个世界北宋的时候，这个社会很稳定的。
好像是国富民安，是吧？一派那个欣欣向荣的这样的地方。
There are many legacies of the Song in today's China, and one that's become celebrated across the world is Chinese cuisine. The Song thought that people should be well fed, and eating became the great social ritual it is today.
Chinese cooking, of course, is one of the great cuisines of the world and the oldest cuisine in the world. But the beginnings lie in poor people's food.
Here they fed both the posh and the working man.
People have had to get used to making the best out of whatever food source they could lay their hands on, and to make it palatable. But by the time of the Song Dynasty, it's, well, the first great restaurant culture of the world. The Chinese people by then are the best fed people in the world, probably the best fed that had ever been in history. And there's wonderful accounts of the restaurant culture of the time. 70 great restaurants here in Kaifeng. The waiters rushing from table to table, taking the orders, and rushing back from the hatch with 3 dishes of food down one arm and 20 bowls down the other, and never making a mistake, says one contemporary. And that restaurant culture brings you etiquette, how to behave at table, how to be considerate to your fellow diners, not to rush, not to chew loudly, to be careful when you're all eating from the same bowl. And that in turn, of course, brings you a kind of foodie culture. They've got cookbooks back in the Song Dynasty. One of them has been reprinted ever since the last time in 2004.
Cool.
Pure recipes from the Mountain House Cookbook. Oranges stuffed with crab meat. Bean curd steamed with hibiscus flowers. And each one of these recipes has got delightful notes by the author telling you where he first picked it up. Take this one. Plum blossom noodle cake soup.
I picked up this recipe from an old scholar in the Zimao Mountains on a beautiful snowy night. And whenever I taste it, the exquisite moment comes flooding back to me.
Let's just move some space.
In a restaurant in Old Kaifeng, we asked the chef to make one of these 11th century recipes adapted for the vegetarian.
薛梨、莲子、银耳，这些东西都是有清热、解毒的。
There's a type of mushroom, pear, and lotus seed.
Lotus seeds.
Yeah.
So you mix mushrooms and fruit. That's very interesting.
Because they have this function of like deflammation.
Oh, wow. It's delicious.
味道很好，谢谢你。
这是我们应该做的。
He says it's his pleasure.
Thank you.
You're
Great. I'm going to finish this off, if that's all right. Is that all right?
The Mountain House Cookbook was one of thousands of books you could buy in Kaifeng. Publishing boomed. From vast imperial encyclopedias to poetry, history and ritual, and self-help manuals for the literate man and woman in the street.
That's amazing.
The Chinese had invented woodblock printing back in the Tang, one of many great inventions with which they led the world. And now in the Song, they devised movable type too, although that never took off in the same way.
Yeah.
The first mention of this is slightly after 1040, a person called Bi Sheng using clay to print with movable typeset. And so each one of this is a Chinese character, and they would form part of a page in a frame.
But it wasn't taken up.
No, no.
The Chinese made this invention, which has proved so useful to the rest of the world, but they didn't find it useful. Why? What was...
It has to do with the Chinese characters, because there are so many of them, and say if you look at this page, almost every character is a different one. Economically, it wasn't viable, it wasn't efficient, especially compared to just using a single woodblock print.
Too cumbersome for such a vast range of characters?
Yes.
And you can see exactly why when East met West in the 20th century with the typewriter.
That's a Chinese typewriter, yeah.
Metal type is a Chinese character.
I watched how what they had to do, the Chinese, to create a keyboard on a computer. And it's like they had to reinvent the whole thing. It was really complicated.
Oh my gosh.
It was such a complicated process. And the fascinating short documentary on how they did that and how to learn to use it. It's pretty amazing. It really is. And then they had to do it for typewriters.
You'd have to choose the right one by navigating this.
And how many characters have they got for this machine then?
Probably about 2,000.
Oh my gosh.
How many do you need to negotiate, say, a newspaper in modern China then?
About 3,000 or 4,000 for the average.
So, strangely enough, although this seems very cumbersome to be carving wood blocks, it's actually much more efficient.
Especially if a book stays in print for centuries, as they do in China.
So tell us about the readership in the Song then. Does reading percolate down into ordinary people?
Well, of course, there are the more sort of elite classes who can read and who are expected to read. But definitely literacy spreading in the Song. Even if they weren't able to read themselves, they would be easily able to find someone who can do that for them.
One of the great things about the Song Dynasty is the attention to what we would call, I suppose, civic values. They even publish books on old age. This, you're not going to believe this, but this is a book about, well, it's called How to Help Old People Live Better, Longer and More Fulfilling Lives. And it was written in 1085. And it's gone through editions in every dynasty of China ever since. And this is the latest 2013 printing. How about that? Now, to care for old people, you have to look at the nature of their whole life. Everybody has things that they really like, things that make them glad. Books and paintings, music. There are millions of things that people like. If a person frequently seeks out the things that they've loved all their life and focuses on their essence and has these things around them, it will give them endless joy and pleasure, and their days will be joyful.
And today's citizens still follow the Song's self-help message.
喜乐，有个喜乐的心，就是锻炼身体，宽心。 就是心胸宽广，什么事情不要往心里放，要对别人宽厚，对自己要严厉。还有老有所为，因为我们因为有时候老年人有那么养老金，有种保障。
Yeah. So dancing is very good. Yeah.
So in its ideas about the good life, the song went beyond any earlier civilization, even the ancient Greeks. And in science, the list of their inventions is incredible. From gunpowder and blast furnaces, to the magnetic compass and evolution theory.
Multiple galaxies.
The most famous scientist...
multiple galaxies in the West. In 1920, astronomers in the West believed that there was only one galaxy, the Milky Way. It wasn't until 1929 Hubble figured out that all those other stars, the star clusters, are other galaxies. So it wasn't until the late 1920s here that they finally figured out there were multiple. Now we know there's billions of them, but they had it figured out back then.
Came from a village down in Fujian on the south coast.
Su Song, there he is, one of the great polymaths of the Song Dynasty, and they don't come much more poly than him. He was an engineer, astronomer, scholar, and poet, but he also wrote treatises on mineralogy and zoology and pharmacology. It's real left brain, right brain stuff, isn't it? But their education enabled them to be both artistic and scientific, endlessly creative and endlessly curious. He reminds you of some of the great figures of the Renaissance in Europe. I suppose you could say that he's the Chinese Leonardo, but to put it more correctly, Leonardo is the Western Su Song.
This is Su Song's pet project, an astronomical clock. His proud hometown has just rebuilt a working replica, 45 feet high. Its mechanism, a water clock driven by an endless chain drive.
Inside the clock, there had to be a clock captain standing like the captain on the bridge of a boat, 24 hours a day, and periodically topping the water level up in the tanks. There you go. Wonderful. Imagining this in the middle of Kaifeng, ringing out the hours, 24 hours a day for the citizens as they go about their business. It's like the Song Dynasty's Big Ben.
Scientific exploration thrived in the Song, in part because there was no theological straitjacket holding back speculation on the nature of time and the universe.
Look at this. You see the goddess of mercy. It's real women's cult here. Isn't this fantastic? It's a people's temple, this.
Taoism and Buddhism were the official cults of the Song Empire. But religion wasn't an area where the government intruded into people's lives. Though always watchful of foreigners, the Song, just like the Tang, had many Muslim and Christian communities, which still survive. And in Kaifeng, so do the last of the Chinese Jews. This is Chinese Rosh Hashanah. Under the Song, the population of China doubled. 100 million in the year 1000, it was 200 million by the late 1200s, more than a third of the world's people. And with a huge urban population, just like the British in the 19th century, the Chinese invented many games and sports, including what they called kickball.
We British, of course, pride ourselves on having invented the world's greatest game, and in a sense that the rules of modern football were established in Britain, in Sheffield to be precise, in the 1860s, that's true. But as usual in this story, the Chinese got there first. Football was massive in the Song Dynasty 1,000 years ago. So I suppose you could say, as the Chinese would,
苏州会照乐 Football's coming home. It wasn't a mass sport, of course, there was no such thing then. But football in the Song was a spectator sport with clubs, handbooks, rules and fans.
The Emperor's not arrived yet.
掌旗者往里一传，球进禁区，注意有机会了，起脚打门！
Oh, wow! Different ways of playing the game in the Song Dynasty. The favourite one, the goals were posts about 10 metres high. The coloured net hung between them with a hole through which you had to shoot the ball.
Oh my gosh.
And of course, being China, ethical conduct was vital. In Song football, it was play up and play the game. Abusing the referee was un-Confucian, and professional fouls unthinkable. Well, almost. And football wasn't just for the elite. China was opening up socially, and that went for government too.
There was definitely a lot of social mobility going on during the Song. The social classes were in flux in some sense. People from all sorts of backgrounds could engage more closely, who were more sensitive towards the social situation. They became involved in government too. New schools for learning opened up, and academies were established as well that sought to teach the classics and also to foster good character.
It was the great age of Confucian social values, and how they set about creating that ethos is startlingly modern.
As you can see, it's Freshers' Week here in Henan University in Kaifeng. The story of universities goes back a long way in China, much further back than in the West. And amazingly, here in Kaifeng, in the 11th century, there was a national university. In 1069, the emperor expanded the student body from 1,000 to more than 3,000. They had financial support and board and lodging, and the big idea was to draw in students from the provinces, talented youngsters, perhaps even from middling or lower families, to come into the metropolis for the best education. And the goal, as the emperor put it himself, for the morality of the culture. As educationalists say today, the ethos is the thing.
For the examinations, the students studied literature, history, and Confucian classics. The emperor and his advisors were looking for tomorrow's administrators to govern a harmonious Confucian society.
There was a new class of literati who previously perhaps didn't have the chance to sit through the examination system, but now they had. Confucian teachings were really at the core of these civil examinations. And because they had such an important role to play in those examinations, and that so many people took examinations, it meant that it was a way for Confucian ideas to really permeate into society. You could say that it was a meritocratic society where excellence in learning was really prized.
Meritocratic, but not universal. Half of the population were excluded from this educational revolution. Women. But ironically, it's through the writings of a woman that we get one of the best insights into the world of the song. These students are studying her work in today's university in Kaifeng. She's the poet, Li Qingzhao.
哪是贵族大家出身的这个小姐应该作为的风度、体态不羁的风度啊！李清照，薄雾浓云愁永昼，开始。飞鸟相亲手，佳节又重阳，玉枕纱厨，半夜凉初透。东篱把酒黄昏后，有暗香盈袖，莫道不销魂。
I spoke.
Li Qingzhao. She's one of China's greatest poets. Her father had encouraged her to write poetry from an early age and attend male poetic gatherings. And she was already famous and in print when she was 17, when she married a student from the university here in Kaifeng. And they spent a lot of time here in the great old Buddhist temple in the middle of town, wandering its courtyards, making rice paper rubbings of its inscriptions. But recent feminist criticism here in China is giving us another view of her altogether. The strains within her marriage in a society dominated by men. The ambitions of a brilliant woman to find a voice that was not only interior and personal, but public and political.
She was criticised by some at the time for saying things. For writing poetry, women were not supposed to write poetry. This was, you know, a man thing. And poetry was one of the major ways of social interaction amongst men. You would go and drink a cup of wine and you would compose poetry with each other. You would say 2 lines of a poem and I would give you the next 2 lines. You would create new poetry in that way. Women could do this, but increasingly there were courtesans who did this. Respectable women didn't participate with men doing it. They still wrote, but we don't have very much surviving.
A lot of women wrote poetry.
A lot of women did write poetry, yes.
Yeah. Being published is a different matter.
That's right, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Paradoxical period for women, isn't it, the song? You know, so many social advances, women's voice appearing strongly, perhaps for the first time, and yet foot binding starting to become widespread.
It's very mixed because women become crucial to this political notion of loyalty. They have their equal part to play in that. But at the same time, they are also being, their rights that they have previously had, their economic rights, are being taken away from them.
So women could be highly educated, but to play their part in male-led Confucian society, women were to cultivate loyalty to father, husband, and state, to ensure national cohesion. So wrote the leading conservative, the historian Sima Guang. But in the late 11th century, right up to the top, the old way of doing things was challenged. The leading light in the reformers was a man called Wang a southerner who'd spent 20 years in local government. Wang pushed reforms across the board. Fairer taxes, government loans for the poor, new degrees in law and science, breaking down class barriers in the name of economic efficiency. With growing threats on its frontiers, the state had an enormous defense budget, and Wang thought a more open society would make the economy work better.
The Confucian classics, the old way of doing things, were put in their place. They had to have practical application. And of course, the old-fashioned Confucian bureaucrats were horrified. And they took their case to the emperor here in the palace in Kaifeng.
The emperor favored the reformers. But the conservatives in his council saw root and branch reform as potentially destabilizing in uncertain times.
In the winter of 1070, the great conservative opponent of the reforms, Sima Guang, petitioned the emperor. He said, "We don't need these new laws. What we need are good men trained in the old ways."
Look at the last 1500 years of Chinese history, said Sima Guang. You'll see the periods of peace add up to only 300 years, if that. This shows how hard it is to create order and how hard you must work to keep it once you've got it.
And he ended with this: "I fear at the moment that our house may not be able to shelter our nation from the rains and the storms that are to come."
Okay.
It's one of the great what-ifs of history. At this point, towards 1100, China could have become the first modern society, with the most egalitarian system of government anywhere before modern times. Why that didn't happen was due to events beyond their control, which would eventually overwhelm them. The last 50 years of Song China saw climate change and famine, the incessant drumbeat of foreign armies on the frontiers. The mandate of heaven was not yet lost, but the harmony had gone. A contemporary wrote, "The problem was the wasting of national resources. Public opinion wanted defense spending, not grand building projects."
The achievements of the Song Dynasty for 100 years were amazing across every field of human endeavor. In 1101, the last great emperor of the united northern and southern Sung came to the throne, Huizong. He was a Renaissance prince, surrounded himself with poets and thinkers. He was an accomplished painter. In his wonderful gardens, he listened to symphonies by Buddhist musicians. But as he plunged deeper into his introverted speculations about sacred kingship, he lost touch with reality. When much harder choices were needed, choices about military expenditure and defense budgets, and deployment of armies as the barbarian forces gathered on the frontier. And when the crisis came, as he himself admitted, I myself was mediocre, and in the end, I failed the nation.
The Song shared the East Asian landmass with many other states. And in the 1120s, Jurchen invaders swept down from the north. In 1127, the siege of Kaifeng began.
It's one of the greatest, most poignant tragedies in Chinese history. Just imagine the scene. Thick snow swirling down from the sky. On the horizon, the gate towers of the outer city are on fire. Many of the houses are burning. And here, inside the walls of the inner city, are hundreds of thousands of terrified citizens of Kaifeng, still resisting hopelessly. The food's run out, the markets are empty. There are rumors even that people are eating human flesh. And the government now try to buy off the invaders, but there's no cards left to play. When they give gold, the invaders want more. They want millions of ounces of gold and silver. They want precious silks and fine wines. They want antiques and temple bells and ritual vessels. They want the musical instruments played by the imperial orchestra. And they want people. They want craftsmen, but especially they want women. They want the ladies in waiting from the imperial palace. They want the 1,500 female musicians who used to play before the emperor. They want the wives and daughters of the royal family and the courtiers and the leading citizens, all to be delivered to their great camps to the north and south of the city. And of course, many of those women committed suicide rather than go. And so the city, which symbolizes the very best that civilization had yet achieved on Earth, was brought to nothing.
In a bitter poem on the government's incompetence, Li Qingzhao reflected on the catastrophe.
An age of glory passed like a lightning flash. The troops of the northern barbarians appeared as if they had dropped from heaven. Tartar horses paraded in front of your banqueting hall and trampled pearls and emeralds into the fragrant dust. What a waste of time it was for great artists to carve your name into polished cliffs. The mandate of heaven passed from you, but you didn't see. Times change and power passes. It is the pity of the world.
The Emperor Huizong and thousands of his courtiers were seized and taken north, where they died in captivity. But his brother fled beyond the reach of the invaders across the Yangtze River, and vast numbers of refugees followed.
Get a great sense of a Chinese medieval village from here, don't you? The big difference would be that today the houses are made out of brick and concrete. Then they would have been wooden-framed, wooden-fronted houses like those old ones over there. And the people here were not scholars and bureaucrats. They were boatmen and dockers and warehousemen.
And among the millions who fled south was the poet Li Qingzhao.
Those who lived in the west of the Yangtze River basin fled east. Those in north fled south. Those in the hills fled to the cities. Those in cities fled to the hills.
Hello.
And in the end, there was no one who was not uprooted. And I myself, Li Qingzhao, fled upstream, crossed the river near the rapids, and got to Jinhua. There I found a place to live in the house of the Chen family. And there, after all the terror and all the hardship, I found some peace of mind.
And so the patient and long-suffering Chinese people set out once more, as they have so often, to rebuild, refusing to give up on the Song dream. And it was here in the south, in the 12th century, that Chinese civilization was reborn in what we call the Southern Song.
Up to this point, the South has been politically and to some degree economically somewhat more peripheral to the North. But now is the moment when that completely changes. More and more people are settling in the South. More and more commerce and so on is developing in the South, and the economy booms. China is, in a sense, moving. It's moving from this very northern orientation, a northern east-west orientation, to a much more compact southeastern orientation that tends to be how we think of China now.
The site they chose for the new capital was a then unimportant place called Hangzhou, standing on the West Lake, one of China's loveliest spots.
The Chinese have a proverb: in heaven there is paradise, but here on earth there are Suzhou and Hangzhou.
In fact, the story goes Hangzhou was chosen because of the beauty of its landscape. And here they set out to recreate the lost city of dreams.
There's a wonderful Chinese description from that time which gives you a sense of the landscape that has enchanted Chinese poets and painters for more than 1,000 years. Like a camera panning along the horizon from the blue-grey hills across the tranquil surface of the lake, and there where the landscape flattens, glittering like fish scales, the brightly glazed tiles of a myriad rooftops. Here, there was every conceivable amenity of civilization.
So in Hangzhou, Song civilization was restored. From the people's culture to practical government, there were fire stations and hospitals, old people's homes, and even dance pavilions. When the Italian Marco Polo came here in the 13th century, he called it the best city on earth.
There were shops selling beauty products, makeup and face cream, eyeliner, false hair. And if shopping in Hangzhou hadn't worn you out, you could repair to tea shops or wine bars or storytelling houses or huge public theatres. And if that wasn't enough, at the end of the evening, you could go to fabulously appointed, exclusive hostess bars where the most famous courtesans of the time would serenade you with beautiful music. There was even a gay club.
But to really understand the remaking of the Song world, you have to leave the glitter of Hangzhou behind.
That's lovely.
Out in the countryside, south of the river, the southern Song planted hundreds of new towns and villages to supply the capital with food and coal and timber. And here, at the grassroots, they passed on the cultural ethos of the Song. Even now, in the old county towns, you can meet descendants of the governing class.
Ni hao. Hello. God, whoa.
This is Qishan Town, an old Song trading place. Here in Mr. Xie's crumbling family house, the signboard proudly salutes his ancestors who passed the Song civil service exam.
Let me just ask you about the sign above. What does that say?
哪个匾？
Yeah.
这个进士。
进士。
哎，对，进士。
这为什么有这么个匾呢？
当时呢，因为这个进士这个匾呢，是孙子为爷爷献州啊，大概献州受审嘛，因为2个都是进士，爷爷也进士，他孙子也是进士，哎，所以他有这个匾纪念，他是个可能遗传基因。
And despite all the upheavals of the 20th century, the old ideals are still passed on. Upstairs in the altar room, wooden plaques name the ancestors stretching back 1,000 years.
How many ancestors are commemorated here?
我大概一共有40多块吧。
Wow, so it's one of the biggest family lineages in China.
皇帝的亲戚，皇亲国戚。
Oh, so touching.
Across the generations, the thread connecting the living with the dead, the Song ethos of virtue, duty, and Confucian morality. In the 1100s, here in the south, great thinkers like Zhu Xi shaped the Confucian ethos of China until today. Zhu Xi wrote China's most influential book after Confucius, a handbook to family rituals. It was said you could find one in every home in China in the 19th century. It's about the mutual dependence of family and ancestors, as Zhu Xi said, part of the state's effort to guide and transform the people. But the old cycles of Chinese history now returned to haunt them. In the 13th century, the world was turned upside down by the Mongols. Led by Genghis Khan, their armies swept west as far as the walls of Vienna. And they overran northern China, creating the most extensive empire in history. And then, they gradually spread their power into the lands of the southern Song by land and sea, until the last terrible battle.
It was March the 19th, 1279. Dark day in the story of China. We're here almost exactly on the anniversary, and it was a day just like this, with rain and drizzle. By the evening, you couldn't see the far shore. The Song commanders had not defended the narrows here, so the Mongol fleet was able to sail through into the lagoon. And there, the Song navy faced them. They had about 1,000 ships lashed together to form a floating fortress. Their decks protected by wet mud to stop the effects of the fire projectiles from the Mongol catapults. When the battle began, an eyewitness says, the air was full of fiery traces of the Mongol firebombs. But when the tide rose, the Mongols were able to encircle the Song fleet. And in the end, the battle was lost, and the young emperor was trapped. And then the emperor's loyal minister, Lu Xiufu, made a famous speech to the little boy. The affairs of our state have come to this, but we must not disgrace the nation. And he took the boy in his arms, and he jumped into the sea to commit suicide. The little boy's pet white parrot began to screech and flap its wings till it overbalanced the cage and fell into the water after its master. So ended the glory of the Song.
There you go.
How sad.
It is sad. All these great civilizations, they last a while, and then that's it. Let me do stop share here. Yeah. Whoa, but good to know that existed. I didn't know much about it. I don't know if anyone else. But anyone else? Did any of you know anything about the Song Dynasty? Or is it?
A little, but not to this depth.
Yes, I had watched something on television a while back, probably by BBC, about the greatness of the Song and how it was the land of the people, and the taverns and the equality and the food and the, you know, self initiative and the Confucian ideals of service and virtue and scholarship. Yeah, but this was great tonight today.
Like
How sad that the man who before this, who the emperor who just focused, as did the Tsar Nicholas, just focusing on his art, his love of art and beauty and aesthetics, and I was out of touch with what was going on, and it was the fall of his country, this Russia, in the way that it fell, and then these Chinese, and then this. Yeah, I just started crying when I heard this. His whoever he was, representative, grabbing him and saying we must not disgrace our people and jumping into the waters to die. I mean, my God.
And the parrot joined.
And the parrot doing the same, following suit.
But there's that saying, once that humanity achieves something, it's like there's a paradigm that goes into the mental sphere, and it can be recreated. It makes it easier for the something, what's it, the 100th monkey kind of effect. So that was there, that period. Same thing with what happened in Greece. It's not it ends, but it's in the collective unconscious, and it can be picked up on when it's on another place, another time, and then further. So I mean, it just sounds like so much like New York City or London. It's like the foodie culture, the books. It was amazing. Bookstores and self-help manuals. It's like, whoa, it's like they're 1,000 years ahead of everybody. And then it gets forgotten. It's not even mentioned in the West and Western education.
Hey, Joe, maybe have you thought about, since you're doing, I don't know what you've done before, but it might be kind of fun to do Persian art and architecture at some point?
Right, take those thanks. Yeah, I'm kind of going around the world here. I want to do, I'm starting there's a 5-part, I mentioned in the beginning, I don't know if you heard it, 5-part.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. That'll be fun.
I think next time I'll do the Ming Dynasty, and then I'll I'll look for Iran. Yeah, that's good, in the Persian culture.
Yeah.
But Michael Palin, he does a good one on India too.
Right. Okay.
PBS has played this one a variety of times, but I just love it.
Yeah. Well, I'll show this. Did you like him, the presenter, Michael?
Yes, very much.
Yes.
He's this really
he's just infectious.
Yeah, he does the one on India. I'll just stay with that. And okay, so what time we got? We still got a few minutes. Any other thoughts, comments?
Yes, could I suggest an author? Her name is Lisa See, S-E-E, and she is way back, was in China, and she writes books about contemporary and some ancient China. I'd like to recommend one called Snowflower and the Secret Fan, because it talks about those fans and how 2 women wrote to each other on the fans and put them back and forth. But she really, I think, gets the flavor of China a while ago. So it's Lisa See, Snowflower and the Secret Fan, or any of the books she has written.
What is the first word in the secret one? Say it again slowly. Title?
Snowflower. Snowflower.
N-O.
And this
is that
S-N-O-W, like snow. Snow coming down.
Snowflower. Okay.
Yes. Snowflower and the Secret Fan.
What, is she a contemporary writer, did you say?
She is a contemporary writer. Yeah, she comes out with books every couple of years, but I don't know. I started with her a long time ago. I've also been to China. My father served in China in the Second World War. I went to China. China is still China. I mean, I loved it. I was the only one of us who didn't want to go, but I loved it.
And watching this also tells us something about what's motivating China today.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
They had been by the 19th century, good part of this century, they were just poverty and taken advantage of by the West. Well, a lot of
absolutely
wealth of in New England was from the opium trade, and
absolutely
the way that people, even the Kennedys, Joe Kenny, that they invested in that and keeping
Mhm.
people addicted to opium in the, you know, in the 19th
Mhm.
century and making millions off that. And so
Mhm.
China remembers that. And
Yep.
so they knew that. And so their current drive to be a world power and world culture again is they've had it. It's going back to what they had. It's not new, you know. So, and again, if it's once it's created, once it's in the mental, in the collective unconscious, you can tap into that and carry it further. And maybe China's doing that now. It's not forgotten, you know.
Absolutely not. And to me, it was the old and the new were still there. Now, I think things have changed now because they were ripping down so many of their historical places. They talked about the hutongs. That's the little individual like village places. And they just ripped them down in Beijing in most places. You know, next week you won't see this and all. But such contrasts, and I'm sure they're still there today.
Right.
But quite a butt.
How many years?
Sorry?
How many years were you in China?
I was only there for 2 weeks. No, 18 days.
Oh,
It was
I
an
thought-
18-day.
Oh, okay.
No, my dad was there for a couple of years,
I see. I
but
thought
that
you-
was before the Second World War, I guess. He was up and down the Yangtze River with soldiers, and he talks about eating basically nothing or grass and
And of
bug
course,
soup.
Mayor Baba was there, right? He got to, what was the city he went to? Anybody-
Shanghai, as I recall, Shanghai.
Shanghai, yeah.
And he said Kitty Davies' brother Herbert around, didn't he send him to China or some? So there's Baba was doing some work with China, who knows what.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, he was in Shanghai. Okay, we got to end here, unfortunately. So that was good. I hope you all like that, and we'll pick up with China.
And we get more China, right?
Yeah, next time we'll carry on. The next dynasty was the Ming Dynasty, so we'll carry on.
Great.
Great, thank you.
Oh, fantastic.
This is Carol, and I love Farashta's suggestion of Persia because the architecture and the art in Persia is phenomenal.
Okay, so we'll do that next. Thanks, Freshly. Thanks for your.
You're welcome, Jay Baba. I've been missing coming here, and I'm thankfully you're recording them, so there's lots to catch up on.
That reminds me, I got to